Doug Turnbull, if you do not know him, he's the Vice Chairman and Country Head for Canada at DBRS Morningstar Credit Ratings. Doug has more than 40 years of experience in the investment banking industry and is the retired Deputy Chairman of TD Securities. He's worked in Toronto, Tokyo, and New York, where he's advised government, corporate, infrastructure, and public sector clients on numerous public and private market transactions. And I will just say that Doug was also one of the first people involved in our efforts, and he was there for our first conference, and we have him back again, and he's been a big supporter of our work and over the years. So thank you, Doug, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Let me begin by thanking all of you for joining us, and thank our distinguished panel of speakers. I know I speak for everybody in saying how much I'm looking forward to this discussion and the next hour or so. I'm not going to introduce each speaker. I'm going to make a brief introductory comment just to kind of set the stage, and each of you can introduce yourself more fully. In 2014, I co-chaired the Working Group on Natural Resource Development for the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations. We had the privilege of traveling across Canada and meeting with leaders from Aboriginal and Indigenous communities during that process. What we sought was to get their input and insights on how best to advance the natural resource development in Canada. Based on that work, we issued a report in February of 2014 that focused on four key themes: governance, prosperity, the environment, and finance. On governance, we recommended, among other things, establishing a principled, inclusive, and accountable approach, one which allowed Indigenous communities to develop and communicate their community's vision or strategic plan for resource development and build governance models in which roles and responsibilities for their business corporations and institutions were 1, well-defined, 2, durable, 3, accountable, and 4, predictable. I believe that recommendation remains as relevant today as it was then. With the environment, we called for direct Indigenous involvement in planning, design, management, and ownership on all phases of development, using traditional knowledge to improve assessment processes and outcomes, as well as environmental data and land use information and management. On prosperity and creating a sustainable future, we believe that the best means of eliminating socioeconomic disparities could be achieved through revenue sharing models and encouraging senior business leaders to promote the benefits and advantages of partnering with Indigenous communities. We believe that implementing targeted human resource strategies and policies will increase employment and satisfy labor needs for development. And lastly, on finance, we asked for implementing effective lending and borrowing instruments that can be understood and accessible to Indigenous communities, as well as cooperative partnerships to enable Indigenous communities to pool capital, to share resources, to leverage investment, and pursue joint venture opportunities, and, of particular relevance to this conference, to hold international forums to promote trade, investment, and international partnerships. I'm pleased to say, almost 10 years later, many of these recommendations have come to pass, and notable examples of success exist, but many continue to remain as barriers to investment. And that's what we're all here about to talk about this afternoon. We're going to spend 45 minutes or so having each of our panelists discuss their areas of expertise and their insights, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&A. I'm going to start with Mark. Mark, you've got a big win with the Tlicho All-Season Road P3 project that included the federal government, the government of the Northwest Territories, Kiewit, and your organization. Can you walk us through how that came about and some of the challenges to getting that deal completed? But I'm sure a lot of those challenges exist in any P3 project.
So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Mark Brajer. I'm the CEO of Clicho Investment Corporation, which is the economic development arm of the Clicho government. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Clicho. No? Okay, I guess not. So we're about 100 kilometers west of Yellowknife, between Great Bear and Great Slave Lakes. It's 39,000, Darrell's on. 39,000 square kilometers of land makes up the Clicho self-governing territory, and that's surface and subsurface rights. So I run the development arm, the economic development arm. We have, as of yesterday, we have 2 new businesses. So we have 15 wholly owned businesses and about 16 joint ventures. So we're quite busy, about 400 employees, 67% of which are Clicho. We do everything from construction, road construction. We supply the mines with labor, equipment. We have hotels. We have retail operations, stores in the communities. There's 4 Clicho communities. What else do we do? I'm forgetting about half of our businesses. We own about 100 property and lease them out, commercial and residential. So security business, a networking and infrastructure business as well. So got our hands on a lot of pies. Okay, so now the question being the road. So it's now called the Clicho Highway. It's been open for pretty much since November of 21. It is a 97-kilometer highway from, and for those who've ever been up to Yellowknife, the reverse question mark, which is the road that goes from Edmonton up to Yellowknife, is Highway 3. Goes from Highway 3 up to Wati, which is the second biggest community. It was, it's Highway 9 now, and it was a $240 million P3 project. So the overall project it started with the GNWT putting out a bid. I think 8 or 10 initial companies bid on it. It was a P3 from the start. That was the point of it. And it worked its way down to 3. So when I joined 6 years ago, we were just at a point of the 3 companies were narrowed down. We went through a year of the final bid process, and Kiewit won that. So Kiewit and the Clicho government formed an equity partnership where the Clicho government owns 20% of a company called NSI, North Star Infrastructure, which owns the contract for the road. So basically was the building of the road and now the ops and maintenance of the road for the NWT. Where we came in was we were contracted as Clicho Investment Corp. One of our companies, Clicho Engineering and Environmental Services. We also have a joint venture with Kiewit, and we built half the road, the good half, I always like to say. We built half the road. Oh yeah, the senator took all my good jokes, by the way. So everything's, if you've heard him before, you have to blame him. So we built half the road. So that was our responsibility with Kiewit as a partner, and Kiewit provided financing for the actual project for the GNWT and the Clicho government. And Clicho government, obviously 20% equity, provided financing as well. So probably one of the bigger P3 projects in Canada at the time. I don't know if there's been one bigger since, but pretty successful. We opened a year early, and the construction was very successful. The road is running really well now, and lots of good parts have come out of that, but it really showed the potential for P3 in projects. And I don't know if we'll talk a lot about infrastructure in Northwest Territories, because I know it's been brought up a few times, but there's such a huge amount needed. I could spend the hour and a half myself just talking about that. So I think that's a good start.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Alanna, let's just run across the panel. And Darrell, I want to get you in the conversation also. Welcome. Alanna, why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I don't know if I can beat that. So I'm going to just try and come a little bit second. So my name's Alanna LaRose. I work with RBC's Economics and Thought Leadership Department. And if you haven't heard about that either, we are the thought leadership and economic arm of RBC for the enterprise. We do research and analysis around macroeconomic trends and drivers that affect Canada and Canadians as a whole. One of the work streams I lead is sort of this push towards Indigenous engagement, Indigenous communities, understanding the power that is Indigenous capital. We recently released a paper called 92 to 0 that explored just that, and how essential Indigenous communities and engagement will be for Canada to, at least in my opinion, live up to two of its best promises, which is one is getting to that net zero transition, that electrification of Canada, but the second is also reconciliation. We've seen that with TRC's 94 calls to action, and one of those was 92, which is where the 92 to 0 comes from. So where is it that we as Canadians, both government, private investors, but also financial institutions, enabling that sort of transition and how that comes about? And part of that is, access to capital and ensuring that, we're having this conversation of how do we move from these ways that we have thought about these partnerships in the past. We've really focused on royalties, we've focused on impact benefit agreements, but that's not the future. The future is understanding the power of Indigenous capital, and part of that is equity. Part of that is ensuring a development of resources and tools that allow nations to build out their economic development portfolio. And that is to ensure that they can drive towards their values and goals. So it's really understanding ground up as opposed to sort of speaking top down, working on that long term.
Great. There's a lot for us to circle back on in there, and we'll do that. Clint, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Clint Davis. I'm the President and CEO of Nunasi Corporation. Nunasi Corporation is an Inuit birthright headquartered in Iqaluit, Nunavut. It was established in 1976. It's the oldest Inuit development corporation in the country. And I'd like to tell the story quickly about Nunasi because I think it's a remarkable one and it just demonstrates the foresight that Inuit had. First of all, I should mention I'm Inuk myself from Nunavut, from Labrador. It's really nice to see a fellow Inuk from Nunavut as well, and Matt Pike, who's also a fellow with Arctic360. Anyone been to Labrador? See, I'm speaking to an Arctic conference, so usually there's like 40 hands will go up, and
Darrell's
when I go
going
to
up.
Darrell knows, because when I go to other conferences and on Bay Street or something, I say, anyone been to Labrador? And like nobody puts up their hand, right? And so it's still a part of our country. Prior to coming to Nunasi, I was actually the chair of my Communities Development Corporation for about 11 years. Getting back quickly to the story of Nunasi, though. Nunasi was, first of all, had a shareholder was the Inuit Tapart of Canada, ITK, which is the national Inuit leader, the national Inuit organization for the country, which it still is right now. And the reason why it was established was because the leaders at the time wanted to ensure that Inuit actually had a platform to be able to participate in anticipated economic activity, which they assumed would result as a result of the resolution of land claims. So this was, at the time, there was only the JBNQA, and you still had the regions of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and Nunavut. And so over time, it actually became a shareholding of the Inuit of Nunavut, and so that's where we're at right now. So it actually, to me, it just speaks volumes in terms of the preparedness that Inuit had in terms of recognizing that they needed a platform, that anything that was happening within the North, they had to ensure that they were going to participate in. The one thing I wanted to mention was I've been involved with infrastructure and trying to do infrastructure for a number of years. And the interesting thing about the North is that there's 65,000 Inuit in Canada, and we actually have financial capital in excess of about $5 to $6 billion, right? So it's our capital. And so we do talk about the access to capital, how it's critical, but there is a requirement now, and a lot of work that's happening with respect to what can we do to ensure we can deploy some of that capital for a return in investable projects around infrastructure. I think Mark demonstrated a perfect example as to how P3s can effectively happen within the north. The Iqaluit Airport is another example of how a P3 was utilized. You're never going to address the infrastructure deficit that exists in this country by the simple grant producing or grant approach by governments. This has to be an innovative approach, and it has to be done, not all of it, but a portion of it has to be done by shifting some of that risk so that private capital gets invested for an expected return. So I think with capital that Inuit have, that other Indigenous groups have, I think there's huge potential there to actually have a profound impact in partnership with other private sector capital, and you'll hear from NTI who are actually thinking about doing just that. So, Nakamik, thank you.
Perfect.
Not to set you up
Yeah.
or anything like that, Tim, but
Holy
anyway.
smokes.
I wasn't going to say anything like that.
You're just going to tell a couple jokes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also wasn't expecting to do a double header. So, Tim Brown, Nunavut Tunngavik Incorporated, Assistant Director of Policy and Planning, in charge of infrastructure and housing portfolios. And both of them have been very exciting for the last year and for this particular conversation. I'd like to pick up on Clint's comment about the difference between private sector investment and being able to have that connection. But there is still a role to play for that grant mechanism to enable the development of Inuit capacity. That was my theme the last session. And we're seeing that through the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Fund as a historical investment in Inuit infrastructure, Indigenous infrastructure. That's been very welcome, but it has also created a lot of growing pains at the same time. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Darrell, welcome.
Thank you. Hope you can all hear me. If not, I can crank my volume up.
You're good.
I'm good, thank you. My name is Darrell Beaulieu. I'm the CEO of Denendeh Group of Companies based here in Yellowknife, and we're owned by the 27 First Nations in the Northwest Territories. And thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this panel here. I think infrastructure is very critical, as mentioned. And in Denendeh, you know, we've enjoyed a prolonged period of economic prosperity and stability as a result of some of the investments in the diamond industries. However, that stability will soon be replaced with a period of change and instability. But you know, on the positive side, I think Denendeh remains a region that's with immense economic potential, and but tapping into this potential is going to be requiring some, you know, interregional, intergovernmental, Indigenous cooperation, strategic investments, strong leadership, and of course risk taking, which I think we all are involved in any business. But I think it's really, sometimes I wonder if I should be upbeat or optimistic, or should I be concerned or worried, or should I be just neutral? But you know, it's on the Indigenous side, especially in the Northwest Territories, as you're aware, there's been comprehensive land claims settled. You know, there's 4 major ones: the Inuvialuit, the Gwich'in, the Sahtu, and the Tlicho. And then there was some treaty land entitlement settlements, and there's some 2 large regions which are not settled yet. But on the brighter side of things, you know, I see that there's a lot of discussion on Indigenous-led development, and that includes infrastructure, economic development in various sectors. And for the last 30 years, I've seen that growth, and I think the challenge is sustaining that growth. And with infrastructure, or critical infrastructure, like any country, it's the backbone each in our own geographies, it provides a foundation for everything we do. Not only in mining, but in community development and tourism, etc. So, and moving forward, I hear the voices, saying it must be in partnership and be collaborative. On the other side, of not being Indigenous-led, I guess a quote that I remember, it says, it can be the change or it will happen to us. So I guess where we're going now is how do we create a burning platform for our infrastructure that's really required in the northern regions of Canada, where Indigenous populations are the majority. I'll just stop with that.
Thank you. Maybe we'll just carry on that theme. Clearly, there's all kinds of interest and discussion around the importance and opportunity in Indigenous ownership and operations of northern mines, not just base metals and gold and other things, but also the role that the search for critical minerals can have for the North, and there's been good discussion today on that. When I was thinking about this panel, I kind of put it in the context of uncomfortable truths or elephants in the room. And in my view, clearly infrastructure is one of them. I've got several more that I'll maybe ask the panel's views on. But basic roads and ports and fueling and storage, et cetera, but also capacity building, skills training, accommodations for traditional use of the land, et cetera, in employment practices. I know some governments have done work to identify infrastructure gaps, but I'm curious to know if that's led to specific actionable infrastructure strategies in the North. Can we maybe just spend a little time? Tim, I know NTI is front and center on that.
Absolutely, love to. We're very proud of the Nunavut Infrastructure Gap Report that was released in 2020, the first comprehensive look at the difference or the size of the gap between Nunavut and the rest of Canada, the infrastructure gap. It was a catalyst for these conversations, and we're still in conversations with the government of Nunavut to try and work on the next step, because we imagine that process to grow from a gap report to an infrastructure needs assessment to a long-term infrastructure strategy. And we still need to get there. And in my time, I mentioned 17 years with the government of Nunavut. I remember at Division, it was, we need to develop a long-term infrastructure plan. We're still trying to develop a long-term infrastructure plan. But I mentioned the ICIF as the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Fund as being another game changer for us in terms of being able to actually provide capacity and force the question around a broader discussion around needs assessment and what our infrastructure priorities need to be. Are they community, municipal infrastructure? Are they revenue generating infrastructure projects? Are they signature projects that kind of put a feather in our cap in terms of the overall development of the region? And that really was a lot of our conversation in developing our 2022 ICIF action plan. Because having the discussion at the three regionals, with the three regions in NTI about how do we want to split $250 million did a lot to advance that dialogue.
So that's a perfect segue to my next question, but before that, anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on that?
Sure. May I?
Of course.
So one little stat, which is probably now dated, that I actually like to talk about when you look at the context of Canada's Arctic as compared to other Arctic regions within the world. And I gave a talk a number of years ago at Walrus Talks where The topic was, for me, it was called Inuit Inc., and was the contribution that Inuit have had to the northern economy through its own economic development, corporations, and entrepreneurship. So the global Arctic, when you actually take into account all those Arctic states, the economy itself is about $250 to $300 billion US a year, right, on an annual basis. Probably more than that now. Again, I'm dealing with some dated numbers. Canada's land mass for the global Arctic represents 25%, yet it contributes 2% to the economy, right? Like, think about that. It's 25% of land mass, yet 2% to that global economy. You know, obviously, there's the issue with respect to population. Well, you're probably having challenges around trying to attract population up north if you don't have essential infrastructure, right? Housing, you heard Tim talk about it. Housing is absolutely critical. It is not just critical, it's a crisis in Nunavut. You can look at where broadband and connectivity exists, and you will see Nunavut and Nunasivut as two very dark places because they're not connected, right? So all you have to do is look at what the Nordic countries have done, you look at what Greenland has done, you look at what Iceland has done, and God forbid, you look at what Russia has done. Russia has had, 30% of its GDP comes from the Arctic. That is not the case for Canada. And so I actually think that's an elephant. That's a huge elephant in the room. And to me, some of it is, as Tim mentioned earlier, if you want to talk about, you know, the Arctic and trying to invest in the Arctic, trying to look at development in the Arctic, come up and see the Arctic. Kind of actually have an experience, see what the challenges are, see what the opportunities are, like really see them. Only 15% of Canadians have been to the Arctic, and chances are 50% of those individuals were there because of work. They want to get the hell out of there, right? And that's not a good thing. And someone from the north, I find I actually take that I take offense to that. I'm good friends with the Danish ambassador for Canada, and I'm like, how in God's name does Denmark have such a cultural affinity to Greenland, which is, you know, thousands of miles away? And she said it was such an incredible cultural connection during her, like, as a child, and it's just remarkable to hear that. When in Canada, I don't think we have that, right? I remember talking to a senior official in one of the governments. I was with Jessica. And we talked about the lack of a plan. And Tim mentioned this as well, too. And I truly think, I'm sure Darrell will agree with it, when it comes to infrastructure investment, right now it's like sort of bits and pieces. And nobody can tell us, right? Nobody can say, what will the North look like in 50 years? What's the population? How many schools? Is there a university? How many ports do you have? What are your airlines looking like? What's your immigration strategy? Who's saying any of that? Right? This should be a fundamental part of our GDP. We had a conversation, so Jessica brought it up before I did, because she's obviously smarter than I am, and said, look, we just don't have a plan. And the minister said, oh no, there's a plan. It's the Arctic framework. And we're like, it's just called, first of all, a framework's not a plan. Like, that's just, everybody knows that. That's like an outline. Like, that's not a plan. Secondly, we had one official said, well, you know, Greenland, they have Denmark. And we're like, are you kidding? You do realize that Denmark, no offense to the Danes in the room, you have an economy smaller than Quebec's. This is a $2 trillion economy right here in this country. $2 trillion, one of the largest economies in the world. Yet we don't have paved roads in a major capital city being Iqaluit. There are paved roads. In Madeline, I remember there's paved roads, but it was for the Queen, right? One of the jokes was, I hope well, God bless her heart, she's not going to come back now. But people had said when she was alive, people would say, I hope the Queen comes back so we can get her more of her roads paved. That's right. Like, think about that. Think about that. Like, that's, like, right now, and I've talked to a few friends about this, I feel there's something different that's happening. And it's unfortunate that you see such an atrocious event that shines a light on the Arctic. But I think we have to strike at this moment and to be able to assert ourselves as Indigenous people and Indigenous development corporations to say the time is now to make the necessary investments. And it doesn't just, oh, Eric Jens is in the waiting room, in the lobby. He's not missing much, but I think the time is right now to really think about how do we participate. And it's not just all levels of government. It's not just Indigenous organizations government. The private sector has to be there. They have to be a part of this discussion. We had a beautiful trade mission, our first one over to Greenland, and we saw this in Nuuk, this incredible, state-of-the-art, deep water port, shipping facility thing. I mean, obviously, you can explain it better than and who was the major investor, Darrell, who provided that kind of capital to ensure that this would actually get built? Sun Life, a Canadian company, investing in Nuuk. I have a feeling that Sun Life isn't investing in the north yet. But you look at that and you go, obviously they see value, right? They see that there's an opportunity for investment. And if that's the case, they can do it there, they can certainly do it in the north.
I think they might have been one of the investors in the Decho Bridge across the Mackenzie.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right.
I think they might have been.
Yeah. Well, we'll confirm.
But your point stands.
Yeah.
For
Thank
sure.
you, Senator
You know, in hearing you talk about that, I wonder if one of the differences between us and the Danes is in southern Canada, we really lack good storytellers to capture the imagination of what is in the north and how important that is to Canada as a whole. So,
No, I'm going to jump in there because
Please.
that is something I think that our group tries to do, and I think it is accurate in the sense that I think one of our roles, especially of those of us so I grew up in northern Alberta, I'm Métis, so I grew up pretty close to the Arctic. I'm not going to call myself part of the Arctic, but huge affinity for it. But I do think storytelling is essential. It's really essential to sort of start to weave together why it's not just important for the Arctic, why the Arctic is crucial to Canada as a whole, to in fact the global economy as a whole. We've already heard it here in a couple of different panels, but it's things like, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and with COVID, we have seen that supply chains, we've seen that resiliency can't just come from one place. So if we look at, for example, critical minerals, which we do need for this net zero transition, I'm just going to bring that back in. One of the papers we did stressed that we're going to need $2 trillion over the next 25 years to make those commitments. And part of that is our critical minerals. And part of critical mineral strategy is, even if we're not the only ones who have those minerals, we need those minerals developed and refined and processed in multiple places to ensure that, we don't see some of these challenges that we've seen previously when we center our dependency on one or two positions globally. And I think the other thing is that we have to look at this as a competitive advantage. We have people who grew up there. We have people who understand where the currents are, what they do. We have people who can navigate the land. We have people who can understand where to build a road or how to build it right. We have people who understand, one of my favorite philosophies is called 7-generation thinking. And I think it's something business could actually benefit from, which is the idea of we have to shift our mindset. And maybe this is another elephant in the room, but we have to shift our mindset of how do we define value and over what time, right? It can't just be short-term returns. It has to be, what does long-term investment for long-term gain look like? And resiliency is part of that. And to your point with storytelling, that's part of the storytelling, is telling that story, of shifting that perspective and allowing our Indigenous communities to be at the head of that. Because I don't know if you know this or listening to Clint or anyone, but we're great storytellers. We're great at it. And so I think having that power, having that competitive edge is going to enable Canada to be competitive in this space. And I think it's essential that we continue this research. I know I'd like to do more of it, so, Clint, I'll be bothering you guys some more, trust me. But yeah, so.
Mark?
I think you've got to look at, I got a couple stats for you. Okay, there's 48,000 people in Northwest Territories. That fits in Skydome.
Roger Center.
24.
Brajer Center.
Sorry, I'm an old Ontario guy. 24,000 of those live in Yellowknife.
Yeah.
That's half of it, right? You know how big Northwest Territories is? So when you think about things like that, okay, and I'm going to throw one of my Canor friends under the bus here. Project comes up from Canor to do a remediation project in the heart of Clecho territory. We should be doing that project. They asked for a $60 million bond for a company that's Indigenous, our size, no excuse, cannot do without it. Not an acceptable way for Canada to run. Not if you want to bring Indigenous on board. No possible chance without having a partner who's got really deep pockets. And that's for a mine that was developed, run, shut down by Canada, and then telling all the risk goes to the Indigenous people who that land truly belongs to. That is not okay. And when you start looking at that from an infrastructure point of view, how does that look? Like, one of the things that came up when the senator was up here, took my story, was, yeah, get off a plane and try and download something.
Yeah.
How about go to one of our communities where the download speed is 1/1000th of what it is in this room? 1/1000th. Okay, try and do a Teams meeting. People in communities, community of 50 people, there's absolutely no way. Like there's a Teams meeting, forget about having a video.
Yeah.
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 Forget it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't happen. And those are, when you talk about infrastructure, having a plan, and you're right. There's no plan. The plan is, we'll do this and we'll do this and we'll do this. We've got three big things. We've talked about them all today. We've got, you know, the backbone, the internet, the all the telecom side. We've got roads, because without roads, you don't have exploration, you don't have mining. It costs so much to get anywhere. And the other one, oh my God, it's got right out of my head.
Transmission, sovereignty, and security.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother piece altogether,
Energy.
but.
You need
Energy.
Energy,
Yeah.
thank
You
you.
need energy,
Thank you. My brain's melting away. But having, okay, how much do you pay per kilowatt hour in Toronto?
Yeah.
14 cents? Maybe it's gone up to 20. God, heaven forbid. It's $1.45 in the communities for a kilowatt hour. You're paying 6, 7, 800, and that's supplemented by people in Yellowknife. Think about that. And I know people in southern Ontario and southern Canada don't care about the north, because why would they want to put money into north? But we just talked about critical minerals as being one item. Never mind security of the country.
Yeah.
Okay? Like, who's on the other side? We won't even go there. But just critical minerals. Where's the industry going? Where are all those minerals right now? Or where's a big chunk of them? Who can afford to do exploring when it's $40 or $50 million for a junior company to come in and do exploration? Because the infrastructure isn't there. You have to fly in everything to wherever you are. So sorry, there's a few stories for you.
Oh, that's good.
So I want to come back to your comment around risk and risk allocation. Before that, I want to touch on this strategy question, because I think another uncomfortable truth is in the absence, or worse, the ever-changing nature of a consistent government strategy. And maybe it starts at the federal government and works its way through, but pick your government. I think in the absence of that, you're not going to attract private capital. And I think that's just a factor. You can get around it by well-designed, well-crafted projects, but typically, in my view, it's more haphazard. It's almost, gee, isn't that great? Your road got done through all kinds of hard work and lobbying over probably 40 years, but there wasn't a strategy that said, we're going to build this road, we're going to build the network, we're going to build, as the senator said, a credible deep water port. So I wouldn't mind just spending a couple of minutes just talking about people's perspective on that. Because every time I participate in a conference on Bay Street or elsewhere in the financial community, I can guarantee you people walk away saying, wow, that was a great conference, but nothing's going to come of it because there isn't some overreaching strategy that says, okay, this is how we're going to do it. Anyway, Darrell, how about you kick that off?
Yeah, and just to carry on here in terms of a strategy, if you remember last year, my presentation was introducing the NWT Indigenous Economic Coalition and the purpose that they were put together. And the whole idea was to stimulate the northern economy and looking at long-term infrastructure, medium-term development, and short-term, projects of significance that'll make a difference in people's lives within the next couple of years. So while we were doing that, the Plan Nord came out in Quebec, and that's a strategy for development there. And parallel to that, there was the Northern Corridors concept that came out, because if you look at Canada, 85% of the population lives within 200 kilometers of the US border. In the top 2/3 of the country is majority Indigenous communities, and I would say a majority of the resources of Canada, whether it's oil, gas, minerals, energy, etc., is in the top 2/3. But when you look at the map of Canada and you look for infrastructure, there's very little. So it's very, very critical, I think, that if there is going to be some benefits that business, industry, and governments looking to improving the lives of how projects are conceived, structured, and delivered in the North, Indigenous participation is key here. We've heard that over and over again, that they want to be co-owners and co-developers of resource and infrastructure development that's needed in the North. And the intent of the economic measures component of the comprehensive land claims is to stimulate the economy of the North in their regions. And if you look at the comprehensive land claims map, right from the Nunasi right to Nunavut and Northwest Territories and the Yukon, a majority of those lands are Indigenous owned now. And I don't think they're saying let's not develop it. I think they're saying let's develop it collaboratively. So I think governments, industry, and Indigenous organizations, governments, and also businesses can play a key role in developing the infrastructure in the North. I go back to looking at what's moved the economic needle in the North in the last 30 years. In the Northwest Territories, it was the diamond mines. And it was like looking at your RPM gauge in your vehicle. And when you step on the gas, the RPM goes up and it goes back down. That's what happened in the North. But we need to have a sustainable, economy instead of just revving it up every once in a while or every few decades. So in any case, I think what needs to probably happen is a strategy that's going to include everybody, and whether it's Indigenous governments, industry, and it should be developed not only as a strategy or a framework that's been mentioned earlier, but something that's going to be operational, that has deliverables and some measured successes. So I'll stop there for a minute.
Thank you. Who wants to weigh in on that? Tim? You got us on this topic.
Well, thank you. In my time working with community infrastructure and now with NTI, the impression has been just a bombardment of special topic or specific issue strategies. So mining, tourism, you know, transportation, and some are missing. We don't have one on telecommunications, for example. I think we're at a stage now that we need to be able to put them all in the same pile and start looking at, okay, so what are your infrastructure assumptions in each of these strategies? Yeah. Because the one lesson I learned from, I think that the government of Nunavut has 26 different strategies, and none of them actually coordinate into a place to be able to say, okay, so if we want this result, what kind of infrastructure do we need to have? My experience working with community infrastructure was also interesting in terms of being able to say from the ground up, you need to be able to talk about what are your actual needs first to be able to be met, to have that critical infrastructure. So because also working in the housing sector, it's sexy to talk about number of units going to be built. How are you going to do it right now? I mean, the government of Nunavut announced 3,000 units by 2030. This is a great topic for us in terms of this conversation, in terms like it meant a new relationship between the government of Nunavut, a procurement with the Inuit organizations. But it kind of went past the step of you need land, and that means you need water, and you need solid waste, and you need all of those things that are already behind the 8 ball. So really, just a lot of these thoughts are swirling in terms of being able to say, like, we just need, where is the place? Where do we have this conversation to be able to have, to say, okay, we want this, what do we need to get there?
Well, I think having a collective strategy to address another elephant in the room, right? When we don't know something about a topic, we perceive the risk to be higher than when we do know something about that topic. And I think the more transparency we have, both from government, from Indigenous values, goals, perspectives, and also from, you know, enabler institutions such as financial organizations, I think once we have greater transparency, we reduce that risk. And once that risk is reduced, suddenly that return on that project, and again, I hate to go back to, you know, returns on investment, because I really do think we need to restructure how we think about it. But if you want to look at it in a traditional framework, the greater we can reduce risk, and by that I mean the perception of risk, then I think we suddenly have more excited investors who are willing to look at a longer return, will look at a longer contract period, will be more likely to engage and understand that, you know, these communities, especially Inuit communities, have such a competitive edge when it comes to ensuring that those values, those investments have a return, especially in impact, but also just in terms of traditional structures. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, is that, you know, we all want this to succeed, but we won't put it on the table that we need more transparency. What does government need to do, right? What do we need from government? Maybe we need a very clear roadmap. What about Indigenous governance? What do we need from Indigenous communities? We need, you know, to talk to them, get in the community and say, what are your goals? What is it that, how do you want to participate? How do you want to run this? How do you want to collaborate? What do we need, you know, from investors? We need them to be able to engage in that conversation and understand what, you know, their targets are, what their IRRs are. You know, what else do we need? You know, how do we get Indigenous communities into the equity space? What do they need? Some have great trust claims. They have huge amounts of own source revenues that they can leverage. But what about those who don't? What do they need? You know, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation has a loan guarantee program, right? And that has allowed more communities to participate in equity, which makes them a party to that conversation and brings them to the table. But it also reduces that perception of risk as well. Yeah. And, you know, having people on the board of that project, having committees that regularly meet, that also reduces risk and completion and impact. I mean, Clint knows I could go on about this, and I will, also cede it to these two gentlemen, but I think that's an elephant in the room that we have to discuss is how do we actually operationalize this? And part of that is understanding each of our roles and responsibilities to ensure that that gets done, and that gets done at the accelerated pace that we need. And I'll leave you with one last thought, but so if we look at electricity use in Canada, we're at, I think, 630 terawatts. We are going to have a 50% surge by 2030, and I think a 200% surge by 2040. We need infrastructure. We need critical minerals. We need services and procurement. We need people working in that. We need capacity. That's not going to wait. So, but I'll yield the floor, but I think that's an important, as you say, elephant.
So you'd think we scripted this because each one of these topics takes me exactly to my next topic on my list.
We're just good.
So capital markets play a critical role in any large capital project. And there's plenty of examples from all-weather roads to bridges to power generating to schools, hospitals, airports across Canada and certainly in the north. The genius of P3 financing, if it's well designed and well executed, is that risks tend to be borne by those who are best equipped to bear those risks. And value for money can usually be proven and validated by outside experts, which takes away a lot of the political suspicion or ideological suspicion that why are we not having government do it on its own balance sheet. While capital market participants are well acquainted with P3s, they're less familiar with Indigenous governance and how that relates to risk. And I might be way out on my skis on this one, but I think as a broad statement that stands. Let me state this clearly. There is no shortage of capital in Canada or in the world to finance all the infrastructure that needs to get done. But it's got to be done on terms that fit whatever the model is that the capital market participants are looking for. But there is no shortage of capital. I wonder if we can spend a few minutes and get your perspective on both governance as it pertains to project governance is one thing, but as it pertains to governance that's understood outside of Indigenous communities, and two, on this concept of risk. And maybe Mark and Clint, I shortchanged you guys on the last topic, so why don't you guys kick it off?
Do you want to go ahead? You go ahead.
You go ahead. You start.
So I think there's two issues there, or maybe even three. One is with respect to governance, which I get. And I believe if you look at a very traditional P3, you create an SPV, which in turn isolates the liability, ring fences the liability to ensure you have this operating entity that can actually oversee and manage the project. The Indigenous partner, be they a community or preferably a development corporation, because they're the economic arm which actually understands business risk, would be a party to that SPV. For sure, some partners wouldn't fully understand it, because first and foremost, they have to now accommodate an Indigenous partner, right? So they never had to do it if they're building 5 schools in Alberta, it's concert infrastructure or plenary, whomever, they're the SPV, they're bidding on the contract, they're actually doing it. So for them, they'd have to understand, okay, well, how long does it take a Nunasi or Clicho or corporation or whatever to try and make that decision? What's their process, et cetera? So I think there's one piece. I hope at some point down the road that you do see an Indigenous government issuing a P3. I mean, it's going to take a little bit of time. I don't know how much Indigenous government would have that kind of capital. But I would love to see that happen at a point down the road. I mean, arguably you can say that Greenland's doing it, you know, and then arguably you can even say the government of Nunavut has done it. The other piece, though, and you had mentioned this, Doug, right at the beginning, is capacity, right? And so when I hear we need capacity building, sometimes like it just turns my stomach because I'm like, oh my God, like I've been hearing this since like the mid-90s, and here we are in 2023 and we still talk about capacity. The reality is it's a reality. And it's because you actually have a small body of people with a certain skill set in these particular regions who are doing a whole bunch of things, right? Tim, are you a little bit stretched? You think maybe at work? Yeah, a little bit. As am I. We kind of, and it was so funny when I worked at TD Bank, we were going to meet with an Indigenous Development Corporation, and we met with the CFO and the guys at the bank were like, God, he seems to be doing a whole bunch of stuff. Like, I don't know, like, he's doing this, he has this meeting, he's on these boards. I'm like, yeah, well, that's what happens. Like, you got like 3 people who are running an operation that's generating, you know, about $75 million, or in the case of Alberta, $250 million a year. You got 3 people running it, right? And that's it. So capacity is real. And I think everybody in the room would agree that capacity, to really build out true capacity, something like human capacity, I think there's financial capacity. Maybe limited financial acumen, but there's financial capacity. Human capacity, that is a generational thing. That's going to take time. We need young people looking at other opportunities. They need to be thinking about a changing economy. That's going to take time. But all of us on the stage, I think, would agree, like, we need that capacity now. Otherwise, you're ending up with projects, which I agree, Doug, that there is no source of capital in the world that would not consider an investment in Nunavut, provided that they actually have a full understanding of the risk parameters, right? In many instances, you would have a government entity like the GN who would issue a P3 project like that, but arguably they don't even have the internal capacity or the expertise to assess what is a P3 project. And so I think, like, I really truly believe in the case of Nunavut back home, or in Nunavut or the Northwest Territories, and I'd like to hear Darrell's comment, or sorry, Mark's comments on this, but I think, you know, you have new structures being built, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. They play a very active role in working closely with communities to ensure that they have a good understanding of what is actually project finance, right? So they are there to build out at least immediate capacity for a specific project. You actually have other levels of government who are able to come in and provide that advisory support. I was well aware, and I think Doug, you were too, Infrastructure Ontario had made a number of suggestions that they would work with the Department of Indian Affairs or work with the government of Nunavut or other northern governments to help build that level of capacity to understand these kinds of projects, because these projects have to be predictable too, right? So I think and the last piece is the private sector I think they have to shoulder some of this too. They have to be able to go in and assist with immediate capacity at the same time, be it financial analysis, modeling, basic communication and understanding and education of what is project finance, and speak about the value of that. And you're bang on. Like, I don't think as I said before, I don't think our deficit, the infrastructure deficit in the north, is going to completely be eliminated through P3s. It just won't. I mean, some of the stuff just will not be investable. So it's going to be a mix, but the P3s have to be done well, as you said, and you know them intimately well. And that's where I think you have the private sector and those players, and we know who they are. They know how to do this well. They have the opportunity to be able to help educate the value of that and how the procuring government can actually get value for money that would then contribute. Otherwise, I think you just result in a one and done, right? And so when was the Iqaluit Airport built? 2001.
10, 12?
Yeah, 17, right? So like you would think that would be the model to go, boom, you're into the next one, and there's none. Like, there hasn't been another one, right? Like you know what I mean? And so it's just, so you got a one and done, and then where's the rest? And then we're well aware of some traditional infrastructure that's being built, which is just simply based on grants, and sure, you're right back to where you started. So I think capacity is key. I think you do have to have that long-term plan, but I think other players exist who can actually help right now to really get some traction around some of these projects.
Yeah, we actually planned a cascade of projects. When we were done the highway, we were supposed to go to a bridge next, which has to be done. And I mean, we've had, I won't get into all the details, but it was basically, we had 6 projects lined up. And 18 months after the road was done, we're still not any further along really with the bridge. We're phase one of design. So with that, I mean, that also becomes some of the challenges. And you know, you were talking about, well, not everything can be P3, which is right. But again, I mean, the GNWT's budget isn't going to support nearly the infrastructure we need in the GNWT. I mean, that's where the Canadian government has to come in as well. But one of the things that the P3s do, I think, is it puts more structure around getting projects finished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes when it's strictly government, whether it's federal or territorial or provincial or whatever it happens to be, what happens, I think, becomes this things take a lot longer. It moves at a very much different pace. Because when you're looking at a company, you're dealing with a company like, in the case of us with the road was Kiewit, they can't sit there for a year and say, okay, we got a design team who's waiting for X, Y, and Z. We have to move. Like, it has to be, put the plan in, let's get the plan moving along. And I think that will make not just the project, but all the infrastructure piece go a little bit faster. But they can't all be done that way. I mean, it doesn't make sense, or there's you could kind of say, well, why do we have all this other part of the government and pieces? But it's not. So I think there's a realism piece that comes into play for sure. And then there's pieces that, I don't know many companies that have put their hands up for a remediation project, quite honestly. From a P3 point of view, I'm not sure there's a good investment there. But the reality is, like, they're involved, but they're not involved at that kind of project, right? So there's, when you get into, what needs to be done, and again, it was kind of brought up this morning, for the NWT is a great example on how important is this plan. How important is the plan for us? The diamond mines are in their sunset. For those, again, who don't know, one of the major ones is shutting down in about 3.5 years. It's only 3. The other 2 say they will last 15 or 20 years longer. But once that goes down, that ice road that gets built every year now, because we build half of it, we built the southern portion, it's going to be one less player to pay for it. So it becomes now, because all 3 of them, they have a joint venture to pay for that road. And the Grays Bay project, it's a fantastic project. Nunavut's going forward. It's going to bring a road down to no slave road yet. No slave geological roads in place. That's the ice road. So the senator mentioned that's an ice road. It's going to replace the ice road. There's a lot of environmental piece that has to go through, which are all important. There's a lot of Indigenous touch points that has to go through, which is all important. Because the Clicho government, the land and water boards are all part of that. It's not different than down here. It's a different style than down here. And and I would say, knowing where, I came from Southern Ontario, I went to Vancouver Island, and up north, they aren't the same.
Yeah.
How you look at environmental projects here, like how you put a highway into Ottawa, or a subway in Ottawa, I think it was mentioned this morning, subway in Ottawa, versus how we put a road in Northwest Territories, isn't the same. It's looked at very differently. Tunngavik, and I'll tell you just again, because it's another story, because by the way, my life is a story. So when the mines were put in, the diamond mines went in, there was no caribou review of how caribou migration happened. Changed it all. And now the Clicho and the 5 other First Nations in the area don't really rely on that as their income, but it's part of their culture. Mm-hmm. When that all changed, that was a very upsetting piece because it's different and you don't know how that works. That's part of the infrastructure piece that has to happen, the learning beforehand. So these projects that, down in Southern Ontario may take 2 or 3 years to get approved, and then it takes 5 years to build. That time might double or triple. That's why the plan is so much more important, and having even whether it's financial companies being involved or P3s. That's why it's that much more important to, speed things up just enough, but get it all done right. And it's just very different. It's different how a lot of those come into play. And that is, and again, when you're looking at where is the big infrastructure, yes, is it important to have a subway and an extended subway in Toronto or an extended subway in Ottawa? Absolutely. There's 5 million people live here. I'll go back to, remember, 48,000 people live in Northwest Territories. But without that, things like that Slave Geological Road, exploration in one of the heart of, a critical area, $40 million. There's not a lot of companies that would come in and say, I've got 40 million to look for something that may not be there enough to produce, mining.
So I'm mindful that we're going to all get the hook in less than 5 minutes. There's a lot more clearly we could have talked about. Education being one of them. Urgency, a sense of urgency being another. So we could have spoken for quite some time yet. But I do want to allow time for a question or two. Anyone?
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us today. So I was just wondering if any of the panelists thought that the UNDRIP, so United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, introduced in 2021 was an opportunity for P3s or an impediment. So if I could just, hear your thoughts, that'd be fantastic. Thanks.
Well, quite on that. I don't know. I don't think it's. I don't think we really look at it from an investment point of view. Probably either way. There's other pieces that it becomes that's a very important piece for, and when you think about it, I guess let's look at it from an equity position or ownership, that portion of it. But we don't look at that as, well, that's the document that says we need to do it. We should be doing that on our own. And that's kind of why, that's what we do in our existence as a ECDEV is if I'm going out and saying, okay, I'm going to look at businesses to either buy or buy into or get into some kind of equity position. I don't know that I sit there and think of, well, how does UNDRIP kind of fit into that part? I think when you look at 70 odd points that came out for the Canadian recommendations, that has to be done. To me, that's a thing, that shouldn't even be a question. It should just be that should be on the list of how it gets done, or it gets done. How it gets done, that's another story. But I don't think it should impede the progress that any Indigenous companies have made. And there's only a handful in Northwest Territories and Nunavut that really, we're one of the bigger ones. And in the area, there's so many that are, an ECDEV is 2 people, and they need either help with working together with someone like us, or what Darrell was talking about, which we're part of that Denendeh corporation. But I don't look at UNDRIP as certainly slowing anything down. I think it's something that Canada as a whole has to say, yes, we need to go through all these and get these things done. So whether it's in BC or Northwest Territories, or Ontario, wherever. That's my thought.
I think it may be perceived maybe by some businesses as another level of risk to consider if they're investing, but yeah, I don't really see it as an impediment on our side. Like if anything, maybe it gives some rise to an argument regarding the need for cultural infrastructure or something like that does no longer exist. But it's just another, I think, just another tool that we can actually utilize to demonstrate our place within Canadian society, right?
I mean, it was positioned as a framework, so it is a framework, but it's not new. If you look at, inherent in treaty rights, all the way back to the Royal Proclamation, all the way to Section 35, all the way to duty to consult, it's just another framework tool. Those rights haven't materialized out of nowhere. They've always been in existence. I think we just now have the language for how to engage in them, not on the Indigenous community side, but maybe on the business development side. And I think that's important that, you know, you take the time to understand those frameworks, understand that engagement. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that each community is going to be different. Each community is going to have its own goals and motivations. Yep. And a framework doesn't replace engaging directly with that community or taking the time to build and strengthen those relationships. It's a tool, to Clint's point, but I don't think it changes or alters anything. It just, you know, provides another way to look at something that's always inherently been there.
Terry, do we have time for one more question? I see one.
I just wanted to jump in on that.
Sorry?
Because from our perspective, from NTI's perspective as a political entity, UNDRIP provides a sort of a backstop. And at least like, it's not, to your point, it's not a new conversation, but it's helping frame a new relationship or a renewed relationship. And being able to say, like, you know, we have commitments on housing. That's an investment that comes to it. And to the point about equity, to be able to enable Indigenous participation in P3 projects, to be able to come into that. I'm thinking of an MOU between the Canada Infrastructure Bank and municipalities and the government of Nunavut on water and NTI, to be able to say, okay, now, but we want to bring money to that, and we want to bring capacity to be able to run that P3 relationship. So having UNDRIP there means that we have some guarantee that we're going to have this particular issue in housing being dealt with, when it should always have been dealt with.
I think it's, and let me just, you know, when I came from Ontario, Indigenous conversations where we really need to get involved. Went to BC. BC was, you were in the middle of it, so you felt a little more involved. You go north, you go to the Arctic area, you're in it. It's not a question of, you're in someone else's area now. You're not walking in and saying, well, let's get them being the Indigenous involved. You're in the Indigenous. The Indigenous are like the show. So it's very different depending on where you are in the country. And we need to treat it that way too. And that's part of it, right?
All right. My question, I'm going to front load it just to quickly, a little bit, I would not take too much time. In all of the speeches today, all of the conversations, it's been a talk of infrastructure at the highest end. And the first word that comes out of everybody's mouth after infrastructure is a road, then a mine, then a port, and then the word Indigenous is used. I'll say word right now before I get to it as culture, because culture ultimately is language and shared experience. So if I were to give you $200 million today and say out of the money that you said you have in your capital war chest, and you match it, in the focus of actually building real infrastructure, not mining or anything else, but real infrastructure, what would each of you spend it on?
Darrell, why don't you kick off that? You've been very patient sitting there.
It's really hard not to rip off Clint.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent question. In terms of real infrastructure in the north, and Clint brought it up earlier, if you're going to bring people up and build some infrastructure, they're going to have a place to live, unless they want to live in tents. But at the same time, the transportation, the corridors, whether it's for transportation, energy, etc., is so critical in the north. We've heard the housing, we've heard about the energy, the cost of energy in the north versus other parts of the country. And of course, it's that collaboration and that conversation that's got to be continuous, because in the north, everybody looks at it in a holistic fashion, right? Because one initiative, triggers another. Yes, it'll go to that corridor infrastructure, and you got to realize that infrastructure in the north, based on the current processes, can take anywhere from 10 to 20 years. One piece of infrastructure is that's on the books right now is worth about $2 billion. So $200 million will just get you started.
Do you want to lightning round this, your answer?
Housing, energy, then the internet, then the roads. Because 200 million, to Darrell's point, won't do anything for roads. Does a lot for the others. And without things like where the backbone is for technology, you can't do things like, I'd love to start a digital economy up north. Can't do it without power, can't do it without infrastructure, internet. So those two, to me, are number ones. And I don't know if it's cash or check, but let me know. I'm right over there.
He said it was matching funds.
He says matching funds.
I'm okay. I'll find 200 million. I'm good with that.
Lightning round, obviously housing I think is important, but I'm going to speak to two things that I'm passionate about, and that is Indigenous youth. And I think they need two things to ensure that they stay within the communities, obviously travel, obviously learn, obviously come back and get educated. But I know even for me, and I wasn't that isolated, that, you know, having a job where you live, especially in rural, remote places, is next to impossible sometimes. And so I think there's two ways to make that happen. One is energy, and that's to fund broadband internet, to fund that sort of investment in infrastructure, because then you can have remote jobs. You can have education where kids don't have to, at the age of 13 or 14 or 16 or 20, suddenly go off to places to live with strangers, and that's really hard to succeed in, right? You can get your education there. You can connect with different communities in Greenland and Iceland. I mean, how cool would that be?
Outstanding.
Right? Yeah. Like, you know, to have the youth of the Arctic get together, you know, once a month and be able to innovate and have ideas. That's where economies are born, is with that generation. And I know I can go long, so I'm not going to, but I'm going to say that. Energy to fund infrastructure to fund young entrepreneurs and the economy.
Clint?
50 million for water, wastewater. I mean, like you need water. Humans need water, and you don't have clean water at times, and that's housing, another 100 million, 50 million for connectivity. But that's all equity positions, so you raise the rest of the debt.
Exactly.
For revenue generating, exactly.
OSRs.
Yeah. I want to bring in a different level of infrastructure we haven't talked about, is social infrastructure. And housing kind of fits in that, but to your point about youth, we didn't get to this situation in the north overnight. It's been decades of colonial policies, and that's the other elephant I want to kind of kill in this conversation, because we need to be able to decolonize the north. And for that, you need to be able to have, like, I'll talk a bit about the Nunavut Unit Housing Action Plan. Our focus is on trying to fill the gaps in the housing continuum. Yes, we want to talk about affordable home ownership and affordable rental. That's the goal. But really, where we need to be focusing is on supportive housing, housing that comes with programs, that comes with that, to be able to bring those life skills back, you know, that education that we need. And it's really hard as a toss-up, because I'm a housing guy, but broadband is the key for the future in terms of being able to enable all of that stuff, and energy is there also. It's just, you come back to, you need the housing. It's just such a conundrum.
Great question, by the way. Hopefully you've all enjoyed this and found it insightful and thoughtful. Thank you to this amazing panel. Darrell, thank you for zooming in. And Jessica, over to you.
And thank you for moderating, and thank you all. It was fantastic conversation, and obviously to be continued on a regular basis so we can actually get somewhere. So thank you.